Why is that? If Jesus really called himself God, wouldn't that be widely known? Wouldn't Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Q, and the sources behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Q have known about it? If they knew about it, how in the world could they fail to tell us? Matthew, Mark, and Luke want to write stories about what Jesus said, and they neglect to mention that he called himself God? How could they just leave that part out? They didn't know about it because the historical Jesus did not call himself God. Jesus believed that God has inspired him to speak his word. That doesn't make him God. The question is, did Jesus consider himself to be divine? Now, I'm in a real handicap here because it's quite clear that Jesus in the New Testament does declare himself divine. The clearest proof of that is John chapter 15, verse 1. Jesus explicitly says, I am divine, you are the branches. So I'm really up against it here because did Jesus claim to be God? Okay, let me start off by saying what we're not debating because I think it's very important for us to be on the same page. Now, what we're not debating, before I get what I think we are debating, we are not debating the question, is Jesus God? Most of you think that he is God, and I'm not debating that. I'm not saying that Jesus was not God. I'm an agnostic. I personally don't believe Jesus was, but that's not for debate, okay, just so you understand. Secondly, we're not asking, did the writers of the Gospels think Jesus was God? I think the answer is yes. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in different ways, thought that Jesus was God. But that's not what we're debating. We're debating, did Jesus claim to be God? We're also not debating, does Jesus claim to be God in the New Testament? We're not debating that, because in the New Testament, Jesus does claim to be God. He doesn't claim to be God in any of the passages that Justin just mentioned. As you may notice, if you pay careful attention, Jesus, in none of those passages, does Jesus say, I am God? The first passages he mentioned were from the writings of the Apostle Paul, where Jesus was not speaking. Elsewhere, Jesus talked about being the Son of God. We're asking not that Jesus is the Son of God. We're asking, did Jesus call himself God? He does in some places in the New Testament. John chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. But Jesus know perfectly well what he's saying. They take out stones to stone him to death. I and the Father are one. John 10:30. Unambiguous. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. John 14:9. He prays in John chapter 17, Father, glorify me with the glory that I have in your presence before the world existed. He is claiming to have pre-existed with God before the universe came into existence. You will note something about these four quotations, and I could add a couple more. All four of these come from the Gospel of John. Why don't I have any sayings from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, our earliest Gospels? Because Jesus does not make these claims in our earliest Gospels. Why is that? We're not debating whether Jesus claimed to be God in the New Testament. We're asking, did the historical Jesus himself, the man who walked in Galilee and was crucified in Jerusalem, did he, during his lifetime, say that he was God? My view of this is not a weird view of a particularly liberal agnostic who happens to teach in Chapel Hill. It is that. But it's not only that. The view that I'm going to set forth now is the view that is the dominant view among New Testament scholars throughout the known universe. That Jesus, the historical Jesus, the man, did not declare himself God. Now, the fact that, this is the kind of standard view among scholars doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it wrong, but it is the standard view. I just want you to realize this is just not one of my weird things. I can come out with a few of my weird things later if you want, but this isn't one of them. This is standard stuff. Jesus does claim to be God in the New Testament, especially in the Gospel of John. And so, doesn't that prove that Jesus claimed to be God? Well, I'm going to give a more of a direct refutation to what Justice said when I get around to the rebut this, because I didn't know what he was going to say. And so I didn't prepare, but I'm going to try and say some things directly about that. But what I want to point out, just as a preliminary to that, is that Justin did cite several verses from the New Testament where Jesus, for example, claimed to be the Son of God or the Son of Man. But he didn't do what historians do when they approach the New Testament, which is establish that those verses actually were things that the historical Jesus said. If you believe that everything in the Gospels that is recorded on Jesus' lips is exactly what Jesus said, because you believe that God inspired the Bible, and so if the Bible says Jesus said something, then he really said it. If that's what you personally believe, then that nothing I say can change your mind. But that's not how historians go about establishing what the historical Jesus really said and did, and I need to spend the rest of my time explaining why. Why is it there are sayings of the Gospels that Jesus probably did not actually say? That's the issue. If Justin disagrees with that, then he's going to have to explain how it is that all of the sayings in the New Testament are historically exactly things to said. In other words, he can't. If we're talking about the historical Jesus, we're not talking about what he personally believes about Jesus. We're not talking about his theology. We're not talking about his religious belief. We're talking about history. How do you establish what somebody in the past actually said on historical grounds? If you can't establish something that Jesus actually said it, then you don't know whether he said it or not. Let me explain more fully. The Gospels as historical sources. The Gospels are certainly expressions of the faith of the early Christian authors. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writing down their views of Jesus. They are expressions of faith that are valuable for people of faith today. Of course, the Gospels are where you turn to understand who Jesus was, what he meant, and what he means for you. They are expressions that are valuable for your faith, but that doesn't make them historically accurate. The Gospels is history. Let me talk about how historians go about establishing what really happened in the past. If historians have ancient sources, how do they know if those sources are reliable? This is the same question that we have today. Whenever you read an account in the newspaper, you have to ask, not is it in the newspaper, but is it reliable or not? What do ancient historians want when it comes to ancient sources? They want sources that are numerous. If you've got stories about Alexander the Great, or about Julius Caesar, or about Caesar Augustus, or about anyone else from the ancient world, or from the Middle Ages, or from the Renaissance, you want numerous sources. You want sources that are close to the time in which the events took place. You want sources that are consistent with one another. You want sources that corroborate one another, that say basically the same thing, and yet they say these things without having collaborated with one another. If you're a historian, this is your wish list. Suppose you want to write a biography of Alexander the Great. You want a lot of sources that are near his time, that are basically consistent with one another, that agree on how they present Alexander the Great and what he said and what he did, without having borrowed this information from each other. That's what you want as a historian. You want that for Alexander the Great, you want it for Julius Caesar, and you want it for Jesus. If you're approaching the New Testament as a historian, you have to bracket your personal theological beliefs. You have to approach it the way historians approach sources. In the New Testament, we do have numerous sources. We got 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But these sources are problematic for historians. I'm not saying that they're problematic for believers. I'm not saying you shouldn't base your lives on the teachings of Jesus found in the New Testament. I'm saying if you want to know what Jesus really said and did, these sources are problematic. Let me explain why. If we're looking for those kinds of sources, what do you have in the New Testament? First, the dates of the Gospels. Justin, sounds like we agree pretty much that the Gospels are written decades after the life of Jesus.
If you actually look at the Bible historically, Bart Ehrman's right, Jesus never clearly said, "I am God." The verses that sound like that, like John 8:58, "Before Abraham was, I am," or John 10:30, "I and the Father are one," come from the Gospel of John, the latest Gospel, written about 60 years after Jesus' death. But in the earliest Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus never makes that kind of claim. In Mark 10:18, when someone calls him "good teacher," Jesus answers, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." That doesn't sound like someone claiming to be God. In Mark 13:32, Jesus even says, "No one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, but only the Father." That shows a clear difference between Jesus and God. Historically, this makes sense. The Gospel of John reflects a later stage of Christian belief, when followers started seeing Jesus as divine. Scholars see it as theology written into history, not direct eyewitness memory. If we look at the timeline, the idea of Jesus being God developed after his death, not during his life. The man who taught in Galilee probably never claimed divinity. That came later, as his followers tried to explain who he was and why his message mattered.
I think the gospel between 70 and 90 AD. Justin is dating them between 60 and 90. Fine. Jesus died around the year 30. That means the Gospels were written 30 to 60 years later. They are our earliest sources. The first account of Jesus' words comes to us from a source written 30, 40, 50 years later. Well, who wrote these books? Weren't they eyewitnesses? The authors of the New Testament Gospels do not claim to be eyewitnesses. They don't claim to be people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They are written anonymously. They are not written in Jesus' native language, Aramaic. They're written in another language, Greek. They were not written by lower-class fishermen and other peasants. They were written by highly educated, Greek-speaking people living 40, 50 years later who were living in other parts of the world. Where do they get their information from? They don't tell us. Luke indicates that people had passed on this information to the time there were eyewitnesses, but what are his specific sources? He doesn't tell us. Mark doesn't tell us. Matthew doesn't tell us. John doesn't tell us. What scholars have long thought is that these stories have come down to the gospel writers by word of mouth. There weren't gospels floating around a year after Jesus died, or 2 years later, or 5 years later, or 20 years later. It was 40 years later. That's when they were first written. Well, where'd they get the stories from word of mouth? People told stories about Jesus. Jesus died. People started telling stories about him. One person told another, who told another, who told another, who told another. You know what happens to stories when they get told by word of mouth? Have you ever had stories told about you told by word of mouth? Are they always historically accurate? Oh yeah, but it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't change anything? Why wouldn't it have changed anything? Did they think these stories were going to show up in the Bible someday? They were just telling stories about Jesus. Stories change over time. And they especially change in societies that don't have written records. We sometimes hear that in oral cultures, people preserve traditions accurately. That's absolutely wrong. As any cultural anthropologist who has studied oral cultures will tell you, in oral cultures, stories change all the time because it's important to change the story for your audience and for the needs of hand and for what you think is most important. People are changing the stories year after year, decade after decade, before anybody writes them down. That's one of the reasons there are so many discrepancies in our surviving Gospels. The discrepancies of the Gospels show us that stories have been changed over the years. Let me say something about the discrepancies of our Gospels. And I should just say up front, this is what convinced me that my views about the Bible were wrong when I was in my 20s. When I was diligently studying the New Testament Gospels in the original Greek, I started finding discrepancies. I knew people had said that. I didn't believe it because it was just a bunch of liberals saying these things. So I didn't believe them. But then I started studying. I started realizing there are discrepancies. And once you realize it there, you start finding them. Lots of them. There are important differences among our Gospels that cannot be reconciled with one another. You don't have to take my word for this. Simply read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John next to each other. The problem is when we read the New Testament, we tend to read all of Matthew. We go from the beginning to the end. It's about the life and death of Jesus. It's the gospel, the life and death of Jesus. Then you read Mark, and it sounds like Matthew, life, death, and Jesus. Then you go to Luke, sounds like Matthew and Mark, hypothetical Jesus. To John, that's a little different than basically hypothetical Jesus. And so it all sounds the same because you're reading it from top to bottom. The way to see that these gospels are different from each other is not to read them top to bottom, it's to read them across each other. Read a story of Matthew, then the same story of Mark, from the same story of Luke, and compare them in detail. Do it with the resurrection narratives. Just read for yourself the resurrection narratives and ask yourself, can you reconcile these gospels? Who goes to the tomb? Okay, some women. Is it one woman or several women? If it's several women, what are their names? It depends which gospel you read. What do they see there? Do they see a man there or two men there, or do they see an angel there? Depends which gospel you read. Was the stone already rolled away from the tomb before they got there or after they got there? Depends which gospel that you read. What are they told to do? Are they supposed to go tell the disciples that they're to meet Jesus in Galilee? Or are they to go tell the disciples that Jesus is going to show us to them where they are in Jerusalem? Depends which gospel you read. Do the women tell anybody? In one gospel, they don't tell anybody. In the others, they go tell. Do the disciples go to Jerusalem, stay in Jerusalem to meet with Jesus, or do they go to Galilee to meet with Jesus? They left them when they did all of it. No. Read them carefully. Matthew's gospel is unambiguous. The disciples immediately go to Galilee, 100 miles away, and that's where they meet Jesus. Luke is explicit. The disciples never leave Jerusalem for over a month where they see Jesus. It's unambiguous. These are rather important differences. Some of the discrepancies among our gospels are discrepancies writ small. What day did Jesus die? Did Jesus die the afternoon before the Jewish Passover was eaten? Or did he live through that day and eat the Passover meal and die the next morning? It depends if you want to follow John or Mark, because they both are explicit when Jesus died, and they disagree. Well, that's a little detail. Who cares who would say he died? What matters is he died, right? Yes, if you're a believer, that's what matters. He died. But I'm asking, are the Gospels historically accurate? Sometimes the discrepancies are writ large, such as Jesus' teachings about himself. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus does not go around declaring who he is. What Jesus principally teaches about himself in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that he has to go to Jerusalem and be rejected by the scribes and elders and be crucified and then raised from the dead. He has to suffer and die and be raised. That's what he teaches about himself. What about the Gospel of John? Whereas Jesus does not say very much at all about himself in Matthew, Mark, Luke, in the Gospel of John, virtually all he talks about is who he is. He is the one who has come from heaven. He is the one who has come from God. He is the way to God. He is the way, the truth, and the light. No one comes to the Father but through him. He is the resurrection and the light. He is the light of the world. He is the bread of life. Jesus says, I am. All of these things. I am, I am, I am, I am, in the Gospel of John. That is incredibly different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What is the payout for historians? Because our Gospels have so many discrepancies, because they're written 40, 50, 60 years after the events they narrate by people who were not eyewitnesses, who probably did not know eyewitnesses, who don't claim to be eyewitnesses, or who claim to know eyewitnesses. They're written by people living at a different time in a different country, speaking a different language, who have heard stories about Jesus that have been passed around by word of mouth year after year and decade after decade. Because of that, historians do not think that the Gospels can simply be quoted if you want to know what historically happened in the life of Jesus. It isn't good enough simply to quote verse after verse and say, see, Jesus said that. See, Jesus said that. Did Jesus say that particular thing? Or not? How you know? Historians have to apply rigorous historical criteria. in order to know. Our most reliable sources are usually thought to be our earliest sources. So, for example, the Gospel of Mark is not perfectly reliable, but it's 30 years earlier than the Gospel of John. It's probably more reliable than the Gospel of John. But you simply can't take Mark and what Mark has to say, or what Hugh has to say, or what Matthew has to say, and assume that that's what Jesus actually said. We have to show it on historical grounds. Jesus makes exalted claims for himself in the Gospel of John. There, he doesn't simply claim to be the Son of God. He doesn't claim just to be the Son of Man. He claims to be equal with God. He does not make those claims in our earliest Gospels or in the sources of our earliest Gospels. Why is that? If Jesus really called himself God, wouldn't that be widely known? Wouldn't Matthew, Mark, and Luke and Q and the sources behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke and Q have known about it? If they knew about it, how in the world could they fail to tell us? Matthew, Mark, and Luke want to write stories about what Jesus said, and they neglect to mention that he called himself God? How could they just leave that part out if they knew about it? They probably didn't know about it. They didn't know about it because the historical Jesus did not call himself God.
Justin Bass argues that the earliest writings, like Paul's letters, already show Jesus being worshipped as God, calling that a mutation in Jewish monotheism. But if we look at it historically, that doesn't prove Jesus claimed divinity. It shows how fast beliefs about him changed after his death. Paul's letters were written around 20 years after Jesus died, before any gospel existed. In Philippians 2:6-11, there's a hymn where Jesus is given the name above every name. But notice, Paul never says Jesus is God. The passage says Jesus was exalted by God, not that he was God himself. That's a massive difference. In Jewish thought, calling someone Lord didn't automatically mean divine. The Greek word kyrios, often translated as Lord, was used for respect, like master or teacher. Over time, followers used that same title for Jesus in worship, which shows devotion, not equality with God. Even Justin admits that Jesus never said, "I am God." The Greek word for God, ho theos, never appears on Jesus' lips referring to himself, not even in the Gospel of John. Instead, in John 14:28, Jesus says, "The Father is greater than I." That's not a divine claim. It's the opposite. What actually happened is what historians call theological development. After Jesus died, his followers began interpreting his resurrection as proof that God had exalted him. As Bart Ehrman and scholars like Larry Hurtado and James Dunn point out, this early worship wasn't based on Jesus declaring himself divine. It was based on what people believed God had done through him.
I want to give you a summary of my opening speech, my key arguments, just to remind you what I'm arguing tonight. First, the earliest writings we have about Jesus, a poem and creeds quoted in Paul's early letters, proclaim him as God. Just as Bart just said, he talked about that as that's not a big deal, but just like you said, wouldn't that be everywhere? When we see that? Well, that's exactly what we see from the earliest writings and traditions we had from within the first decade of Jesus' death. We have people equating him, his followers are equating him in a radically monotheistic Jewish context as Yahweh, as one with God, as redefining the Shema, as saying we worship him. I mean, you need to read Larry Hurtado on this. He has made clear that this is unprecedented, the way Jesus was worshipped and how fast he was worshipped. It's a mutation was his word. It's a great word. It's a mutation within a Jewish monotheism in the first century. Really radical for them to worship Jesus. He's right. Jesus isn't claiming to be God in those evidences, but I'm just showing that if he did claim to be God, it makes sense that his earliest followers would proclaim him as God, and that's exactly what they do, and that's the argument. The second thing is Jesus made implicit claims that he is divine during his public ministry. Yes, John Meyer, one of the greatest reflected scholars of our time, has said Jesus almost made a riddle about himself. There is no doubt that the way Jesus presented himself, it was not clear. He wants to present Jesus as going around saying he's God in the Gospel of John, but that's not true either. Jesus never said ego eimi ha theos, not even in John. To those who have ears to hear. Right. But Jesus never claimed to be God, the word God. In Greek, the word God is ha theos. Jesus never says, I'm ha theos. He never says that. He says it even in John in cryptic ways. He quoted the only passages where he does that. Because even in John, he's constantly saying, I came to reveal the Father. He's constantly pointing away from himself and pointing to the Father. But in climactic moments, which in John, he's in Jerusalem a lot more. In John, most of the time, Jesus' ministry is in Jerusalem. In the Synoptics, most of his ministry is in Galilee and in the Decapolis and things like that. So it makes sense that maybe in Jerusalem, he did make more exalted claims about himself. Interestingly, in the Synoptics, the highest claim Jesus makes is in Jerusalem, and it's the night before he crucified. So it's almost like Jesus had this riddle about himself throughout his whole ministry. I mean, we see it in the Gospels. What are they saying? Who is this? Who is this that can command the wind and the waves? Who is this? And it seems like he solved it on that trial scene, the night before he's crucified. And Bart wants to try to say that, oh, this is the majority of scholars, the dominant view of scholars is that Jesus didn't claim to be God. Well, if he claimed to be the Son of Man, that is not true. I could give you a long list of scholars that Bart himself greatly respects. In fact, he says in his book that Raymond Brown, the late great Raymond Brown, and I agree with him, is probably the greatest New Testament scholar in the second half of the 20th century. He says this in How Jesus Became God. Guess what? Raymond Brown said that scene in Mark 14 was historic. And Jesus did claim to be God. And he's not the only one. But let me read you what he said. He said, Jesus could have spoken of the Son of Man as his understanding of his role in God's plan, precisely where he was faced with hostile challenges reflecting the expectations of his contemporary. Inevitably, the Christian record would have crossed the T's and dotted the I's of the scriptural background of his words. Even though all of Mark 14, 61 through 62 in parallels is phrased in Christian language of the 60s. Language not unrelated to 80, 30, and 33. So he agrees. Yeah, Mark's colored this thing. This isn't a verbatim account, and we would all agree with that. But then he says, there is reason to believe that in 1462, we may be close to the mindset and style of Jesus. So the question is did the historical Jesus actually make this claim to be the Son of Man? If he did, Bart agrees it was blasphemy. And this was a claim of divinity. This was a claim that he was in some sense equal with God Almighty. This was true of the way the Son of Man is pictured in Second Temple Judaism. In First Enoch, he sits on the throne, he's worshipped, and all this goes back to Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, you have this Son of Man figure flying on the clouds. Only God does that. He is worshipped. He reigns over God's kingdom. Who is this Son of Man? You have the Ancient of Days, and you have the Son of Man. This fits with what Paul is doing. Paul probably looked at things like this, and that's how he could put Jesus within the one God. That's why he could say to Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and see the Lord as Jesus and God as God the Father. So Jesus claimed to be Son of Man. As I said, he claimed to be the Son of Man 81 times. 81 times. So he laid out all the sources. He laid out all the historical investigation. Hey, I'm disappointed he didn't see how hard I worked to say that fit that criteria. Because I did. And the Son of Man passes all this criteria with flying colors. It's in Q, it's in If, it's in L, it's in Mark, it's in John. It passes the criteria of dissimilarity. No one talked about the Son of Man suffering and dying. No one talked about, no one after Jesus claimed Jesus was the Son of Man. That's not a title that the early church used. So why does it occur 81 times on the lips of Jesus? Where does it come from? It's a fascinating claim. It's the way Jesus proclaims himself, and it was unique, and there was a riddle, it was a cipher, but ultimately he made it clear in that trial saying, I am the Son of Man, and I am the Lord of Psalm 110. This is the way you call yourself God in the Jewish sense, in a Bradican monotheistic context, and that's exactly how Jesus claimed to be God in the Synod. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. So I think in Justin's rebuttal, he was more or less reasserting his earlier points rather than addressing what I argued. And so I I want to note that some of the issues that are great, all the issues there is, he should have taught to address. So I'm going to have more time to address these things, and so we can do that during the back and forth we're going to have, and you all are going to be able to ask questions of both of us. I just asked, and you ask me a question, you make it a softball. I do want to address the things Justin said in his first thought. His first point that he spent probably maybe half of his time on was that early Christian authors called Jesus divine, and I completely agree with that. And it has no bearing on the question, because the question is not whether Paul thought Jesus was divine, or whether John thought Jesus was divine, or whether Mark thought Jesus was divine. The question is whether could Jesus call himself divine. And so quoting Philippians 2 or 1 Corinthians 8 or any other passage is not relevant to that question. He doesn't want to focus a lot on the Son of Man issue. The Son of Man issue, I don't know if you all are picking up on this. The Son of Man issue is one of the thorniest issues that New Testament scholars have had to deal with for over 150 years. New Testament scholars, many of whom are among the brightest human beings who've ever walked the planet, have tried to figure out the Son of Man issue in the New Testament. And I can just tell you, to put it in simple terms, it ain't easy. The Son of Man sayings on Jesus' lips in the Gospel, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's where principally you get the Son of Man saying, are really complicated. And I'm debating whether to try and explain the complication or whether it's just going to take us down some kind of muddy road that we don't want to go down. But, well, why not? So, there are three kinds of sayings of the Son of Man. I'm watching your time, but no, that's okay. You can answer that way. There are three kinds of Son of Man sayings in the New Testament on the lips of Jesus. Sometimes Jesus clearly talks about himself as the Son of Man. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem. Foxes have lairs, birds have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's not saying to be God. It's just a way of saying me. I'm not I. The Son of Man. A lot of scholars, Lord Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, and some of the best scholars of Aramaic, the Aramaic language of Jesus' day, think the Son of Man was a circumlocution for the word I. Now, it's just a way of talking about yourself. Just like when Queen says, we are not amused, she doesn't do we, she means doc. I am not amused. Well, Son of Man was a way in Aramaic to talk about it, so there's no claim to be God there. Sometimes Jesus talked about the Son of Man going to suffer. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem to suffer and die. So the Son of Man suffer and sing. There are some saying Jesus is the Son of Man, where Jesus talks about a figure who's coming from heaven to judge the earth. Those are the ones that Justin is referring to. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven in the presence of the holy angels. Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of that one the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes on the clouds of heaven. There, Jesus is talking about a future cosmic judge of the earth who comes from heaven. He seems to be a divine head figure because he comes from heaven. Scholars have to decide which sayings of Jesus go back to him. This is a point, again, that Justin hasn't dealt with. Which of the sayings of Jesus go back to him? Given the fact that they probably all don't go back to him. And you have to decide about the Son of Man sayings. Did Jesus call himself the Son of Man? The striking thing is that in the first two kinds of sayings, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, the Son of Man must be rejected and crucified, Jesus is talking about himself. But when you look at the Son of Man sayings of the Son of Man who's coming on the clouds of heaven, there is nothing to suggest he's talking about himself. You say, well, if he's talking about himself in the other two, he's not about himself there, right? Wrong. Each of these sayings circulated independently of one another, and you have to figure out which ones originally came from Jesus' lips. You can't simply guess, and you can't simply go with the ones that you like. You have to apply rigorous historical criteria, and one of the criteria the scholars apply is that if there's a saying of Jesus that seems to be something that the early Christians would not have put on his lips,
then that's something he probably said. That's something Christians did upon his lips. The early Christians thought Jesus was the Son of Man. They worshiped him as the Son of Man. If you have Jesus calling himself the Son of Man, could Christians have put that on his lips? Of course they could have. If Jesus talks about the Son of Man in a way that is not obviously about himself, would they have put that on his lips? No, probably not. So when Jesus talks about the coming Son of Man, and he isn't obviously talking about himself, in fact, he gives some indication he's not talking about himself, as in Mark 8:38, they wouldn't have put those on his lips, which means those are the sayings he made, and they're the ones where he doesn't identify himself as the Son of Man. Mark 14:62, that Justin wants to keep talking about, Jesus is talking to the high priest. Who is there in this scene? Just read the account. Mark chapter 14. It's the Jewish council and Jesus. Were any of Jesus' followers there taking notes? No. Who was there? Jesus and his Jewish opponents. How does Mark know what Jesus said? He didn't get it from Jesus. He didn't get it from any of the followers who were there. Did Caiaphas start giving interviews to Christian interviewers? How does Mark? Well, it's pretty obvious to historians what's going on here. What's going on here is what's going on in every ancient history we have from the ancient world. When a historian is trying to write a speech of something someone said and the historian wasn't there to hear it, the historians tell us what they did. They made it up. We have evidence of this going back to Thucydides, a great Greek historian in the 5th century, who tells us that he wasn't there for these speeches. He made them up. He made up what he thought would be appropriate for the occasion. How does Mark know what Jesus said to the high priest? He doesn't know. He made it up to fit the occasion. You can't use that to say that the historical Jesus talked about the Son of Man as himself. Yes, Jesus does talk about himself as a divine Son, as do lots of people in the Bible. 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14, the son of David, Solomon, God, through Nathan, tells David, he will be a son to me and I will be a father to him. Solomon is the son of God. Psalm 2, where God says to the king of Israel, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. The Son of God was the king of Israel. Or sometimes it was Israel. Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt have I called my son. Talking about the Exodus. Israel is the son of God. Does that make Israel God? Of course not. Was Solomon God? Of course not. So is Jesus. Jesus was the Son of God. Yes, Jesus thought that he had special authority from God to speak his word. Jesus believed that God has inspired him to speak his word. That doesn't make him God.
The debate wasn't whether Paul or John believed Jesus was divine. The question was, did the historical Jesus call himself God? And on that, the evidence just isn't there. Bart reminds us that titles like Son of Man and Son of God don't mean divinity. In the Hebrew Bible, Son of God was a royal title. Psalm 2:7 says, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. It's about kingship and authority, not being equal with God. 2. Samuel 7:14 even calls Solomon the son of God. No one thought Solomon was divine. When Jesus used Son of Man, it was likely just a way of saying I, a common Aramaic expression. In Mark 2:10, for example, Jesus says, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. But in the same breath, he prays to God, depends on God, and dies crying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mark 15:34. That's not a man claiming equality with God. That's a man appealing to him. Bart also brings up something most people miss. The Gospels include private conversations between Jesus and his accusers, like the high priest in Mark 14:62, where no followers were present. How could the writer possibly know what was said? Historians know how this worked in ancient writing. Authors reconstructed speeches to fit the story. Greek historians like Thucydides admitted doing this. So when we read those scenes, we're not reading Jesus' own words. We're reading what later authors imagined he might have said. At the end of the day, even Bart agrees Jesus saw himself as someone chosen by God, inspired to speak for him. But that doesn't make him divine. Just like prophets and kings before him, Jesus believed he was carrying out God's will. His followers, decades later, turned that devotion into divinity. So, what do you think? Was Jesus misunderstood by history or reimagined by his followers? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more evidence-based breakdowns like this, remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.